The moment my own son called me a shrew in front of our entire family, I realized my husband hadn't been the only thing I'd lost that week. I still remember how cold the conference room felt that afternoon, even though it was the middle of July in Charleston, and the air outside shimmered above the pavement like heat rising from an oven. The funeral had only been 3 days earlier. 3 days since I buried my husband of 42 years. 3 days since I stood beside a polished oak casket wearing black heels that pinched my swollen feet while strangers told me Richard had been a good man, as though I didn't already know that better than anyone. By the time I walked into Harper & Associates for the reading of the will, I was exhausted in a way sleep couldn't fix. My son Daniel arrived 10 minutes late with his wife Vanessa beside him, her sunglasses still pushed up on her blonde hair even indoors. She carried a designer handbag worth more than my first car, yet somehow she still looked irritated to be there. Daniel barely hugged me. His arm touched my shoulder for less than a second before he stepped away and checked his phone. That hurt more than I expected. When your child is little, you spend years believing no matter how old they get, part of them will always need you. But sometimes they only need what you can give them. My granddaughter Lily sat quietly near the corner of the room scrolling through her tablet, completely detached from everything happening around her. I wondered if she even understood her grandfather was gone. Evelyn Harper, our family attorney for nearly 20 years, adjusted her glasses and gave me a sympathetic smile as we all settled around the long mahogany table. Richard trusted Evelyn with everything. He used to joke that she probably knew our finances better than we did. Before we begin, Evelyn said softly, I'd like to once again express my condolences. Vanessa nodded dramatically, though I noticed she didn't bother removing her gum. Daniel leaned back in his chair with his arms crossed, impatient already. I tried not to notice. I kept telling myself grief makes people behave strangely. Maybe he was hurting too. Maybe none of us knew how to act without Richard holding this family together. Evelyn began reviewing the estate documents carefully, professionally, explaining the trust, the properties, the investment accounts Richard had spent decades building. My husband came from nothing. His father worked construction jobs until his knees gave out, and his mother cleaned motel rooms outside Savannah for almost 30 years. Richard built his company from a single pickup truck and a borrowed toolbox. Every dollar he left behind had cost him something. Time, stress, long nights, missed vacations. Yet he never complained because he believed he was creating security for his family. For our family. Then Evelyn mentioned my portion of the estate. As outlined in the marital trust, she explained, Margaret will retain primary residential rights and receive. Daniel slammed his hand against the table so hard Lily finally looked up from her screen. Absolutely not, he snapped. The room froze. I stared at him confused. Daniel, I whispered. He looked directly at me with a bitterness I had never seen before. If that shrew gets a share, he said loudly, I'm walking out. For a second I genuinely thought I had misheard him. The word hung in the air like smoke. Shrew. My own son had just called me a vicious old woman in front of everyone. My chest tightened so fast I thought I might faint right there beside the conference table. Vanessa lowered her eyes, pretending to look uncomfortable, but I caught it. The tiny smile pulling at the corner of her mouth. Evelyn cleared her throat awkwardly. Daniel, I strongly advise you to calm down. No, he barked. Dad promised this would stay in the family. She doesn't deserve to sit on everything while the rest of us struggle. She. Not Mom. Not Mother. Just she. Like I was some stranger trying to steal from them instead of the woman who gave birth to him at 26 after 14 hours of labor in a county hospital. The woman who worked double shifts at a diner, so he could attend summer baseball camp. The woman who skipped buying herself winter coats, so he could have braces in high school. I felt every sacrifice replay inside my head all at once, while Daniel glared at me like I was his enemy. And somehow what shattered me most wasn't his anger. It was realizing this hatred hadn't appeared overnight. It had been growing quietly inside him for years while I kept calling it love. Nobody defended me. That was the part one kept replaying in my head during the drive home from the lawyer's office. Not Daniel's voice. Not the insult itself. It was the silence afterward. The complete silence from people who had eaten at my table for decades, celebrated Christmas in my living room, and accepted birthday cards from me every single year without fail. Evelyn tried to continue reading the documents after Daniel's outburst, but the atmosphere in the room had changed completely. I could feel it pressing down on my chest like humidity before a summer storm. Daniel sat back in his chair looking angry but not embarrassed, which somehow made it worse. Vanessa leaned close to him and whispered something in his ear that made him smirk faintly. They were not ashamed. They were annoyed. Annoyed that the process was not moving in their favor quickly enough. I folded my hands tightly in my lap because I was afraid they would see them shaking. Perhaps we should take a short break, Evelyn suggested carefully. No, Daniel interrupted. Let us finish this. Finish this. Like we were discussing a business transaction instead of the remains of a man who had barely been buried. I looked toward my granddaughter Lily, hoping for something human in the room, some sign that one person still saw me as family, but she had already gone back to staring at her tablet with earbuds in. She was 13 years old, wearing an oversized sweatshirt that probably cost more than my grocery bill for a week, completely disconnected from the tension surrounding her. I suddenly wondered how many conversations had happened around her over the years. How many times had she heard Vanessa complain about me behind closed doors? How many jokes had Daniel laughed at while I sat at home knitting scarves for birthdays and clipping coupons for their Christmas stockings? Evelyn resumed reading the estate details with visible discomfort. Richard had left me residential rights to the Charleston house, monthly income from investment dividends, and authority over certain charitable contributions we had supported together for years. Daniel's jaw tightened more with every sentence. By the time Evelyn mentioned the lake property in North Carolina, he let out an irritated laugh under his breath. Unbelievable, he muttered. I turned toward him slowly. Your father built those properties over 40 years, I said quietly. They were never yours to begin with. The second the words left my mouth, Vanessa looked at me with open hostility for the first time all afternoon. Her expression lost every trace of politeness. Daniel has worked in the company for 15 years, she said sharply. He sacrificed too. Sacrificed. I almost could not believe that word came out of her mouth. Daniel worked in an air-conditioned office with a six-figure salary Richard handed him straight out of college. Richard had spent decades crawling under broken equipment in Georgia heat waves while Daniel complained if the wireless internet at the office went down for 20 minutes. But I said nothing. That was the strange thing about grief. It drains your energy even for arguments you know you could win. Evelyn finally ended the meeting early after promising additional discussions once all documents were reviewed. Daniel stood up immediately and grabbed his car keys without even looking at me. Vanessa followed him, but before leaving the room she paused near my chair. You should think carefully about what is fair here, she said in a low voice. Daniel is under a lot of pressure. Then she walked away in her expensive heels like she had just offered me wise advice instead of a warning. I sat frozen long after they left. Evelyn closed the folder slowly and sighed. Margaret, she said gently, I need you to understand something. Richard updated portions of this estate 6 months ago. I frowned. Updated them how? She hesitated. That hesitation planted the first real seed of fear inside me. He became concerned about certain financial behaviors involving Daniel. I stared at her. What kind of financial behaviors? Evelyn glanced toward the closed conference room door before lowering her voice. Large debts. Multiple refinanced loans. Some failed investments. For a moment I could not process what she was saying. Daniel and Vanessa lived in a 5,000 square foot home outside Charlotte with marble countertops, luxury SUVs, private school tuition, country club memberships, and vacations in Aspen every winter. They posted smiling photographs online beside wine glasses and mountain views, while telling everyone how blessed they were. I suddenly remembered something Richard said to me months before he died, while we sat on the back porch watching rain move across the yard. Some people spend money to look successful, he told me quietly. Other people become successful by never needing to prove it. At the time I thought he was talking about business competitors. Sitting in that lawyer's office, I realized he had been talking about our son. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Daniel's voice again, sharp and cold across that conference table. By 3 a.m, I gave up trying and walked downstairs to the kitchen, wearing Richard's old navy cardigan over my nightgown because the house suddenly felt too large and too empty without him. The grandfather clock near the dining room ticked steadily through the silence while rain tapped softly against the windows overlooking the backyard. Richard loved this house. He used to say the sound of summer rain on the porch roof was better than any music money could buy. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and sat alone beneath the dim light above the stove, staring at the family photographs covering the refrigerator. Daniel at age 8 holding a fishing pole almost taller than he was. Daniel at 16 wearing a football jersey with grass stains on the knees. Daniel standing beside Vanessa on their wedding day smiling so proudly that Richard cried during the reception toast. Looking at those pictures felt like staring at strangers now. I kept asking myself the same question over and over. When exactly had my son started resenting me? Because resentment like that does not appear overnight. It grows slowly, quietly, fed by years of bitterness someone never says aloud. Around 7 that morning my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. For one foolish second my heart lifted because I thought maybe Daniel had called to apologize. Instead it was my sister Carol from Savannah checking on me after the funeral. The second she heard my voice she knew something was wrong. "Margaret," she said carefully, "what happened?" I tried to answer calmly, but once I started talking I could not stop. The humiliation from the lawyer's office came pouring out of me in pieces. Daniel yelling. Vanessa smirking. The way nobody defended me. Carol listened quietly until I finished. Then she sighed heavily. "I have been worried about Daniel for a while," she admitted. "What do you mean?" There was a pause long enough to make my stomach tighten. "Vanessa talks too much after a few glasses of wine," Carol said. "At Easter she mentioned they were having money problems." I sat up straighter in my chair. "How serious?" "I do not know exactly. But she complained about debt, credit cards, and some investment Daniel made that went bad. She said they were counting on Richard's estate helping them recover." Recover? The word made something click into place inside my mind. Suddenly every uncomfortable moment from the past 2 years looked different. The expensive vacations that appeared online every few months despite Daniel constantly talking about cash flow issues. Vanessa asking strange questions about Richard's properties during Thanksgiving dinner. Daniel becoming irritated anytime Richard donated money to charity instead of discussing family legacy. I remembered one evening last winter when Richard came home unusually quiet after meeting Daniel for dinner. I asked what was wrong, but he only rubbed his forehead and said, "Our son thinks wealth is something you deserve instead of something you build." At the time I thought they had argued about politics or business strategy. Now I understood there had been something deeper underneath it. After hanging up with Carol, I wandered through the house restlessly until I found myself standing outside Richard's study. I had not gone in since he died. The door still smelled faintly of his cedar cologne and old leather chair. His reading glasses remained folded neatly beside a stack of business journals on the desk exactly where he left them. Seeing those ordinary little details nearly broke me all over again. I sat carefully in his chair and opened the top desk drawer searching for nothing in particular, just trying to feel close to him somehow. Inside were old receipts, pens, handwritten notes, and a yellow legal pad filled with numbers in Richard's blocky handwriting. At the bottom of the drawer I found a white envelope with my name written across the front. Margaret. My hands immediately started trembling. The envelope had already been opened once before and resealed. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It was not a letter. It was a list. Dates. Dollar amounts. Property references. Loan balances. Besides several entries Richard had written Daniel's name. And at the bottom of the page, underlined twice in dark ink, was one sentence I could not stop staring at. "If anything happens to me, do not let them pressure you into giving up your security." For the next 2 days, I carried Richard's note around the house like it was made of glass. I folded it carefully and slipped it into the pocket of my cardigan each morning, then read it again before bed as though the words might somehow change overnight. But they never did. Do not let them pressure you into giving up your security. Richard knew. Somehow, before he died, my husband had already seen exactly where this was heading. That realization disturbed me more than Daniel's outburst at the lawyer's office. Because if Richard anticipated this behavior, then it meant the cracks in our family had been visible long before I allowed myself to see them. On Thursday afternoon I forced myself to leave the house for the first time since the reading. The refrigerator was nearly empty except for leftover casseroles neighbors had dropped off after the funeral, and I needed groceries if only to feel normal again. Charleston was heavy with August heat, the kind that made the air stick to your skin the second you stepped outside. I drove slowly with both hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary because lately even simple errands felt exhausting. Halfway through shopping at Harris Teeter, my phone buzzed. Daniel. My stomach tightened immediately. I stared at his name on the screen for several seconds before answering. Hello. His voice sounded strangely calm. Too calm. Mom, we need to talk. Not how are you holding up. Not I am sorry for what I said. Just business. I do not think now is the best time, I replied quietly. Actually, now is exactly the right time, he said. Vanessa and I are coming by tonight around 6. Before I could respond, he hung up. I stood there beside the produce section holding a bag of apples while a young employee sprayed water over rows of lettuce nearby, trying to steady my breathing. The old Daniel would never have spoken to me like that. But the old Daniel seemed to disappear more every day. By 6 that evening I had cleaned the kitchen twice from nervous energy alone. Right on time, a white luxury SUV pulled into the driveway. Vanessa climbed out first wearing cream-colored slacks and large sunglasses even though the sun was already beginning to set. Daniel followed carrying a leather folder tucked beneath one arm. Not flowers. Not dinner. Papers. The second I saw that folder, I knew exactly why they were there. I invited them inside anyway because some foolish part of me still hoped this conversation might somehow repair things between us. Vanessa glanced around the house while removing her sunglasses. This place is so much bigger than one person needs, she remarked casually. The comment landed exactly the way she intended. Daniel sat at the dining room table Richard built himself nearly 20 years earlier, and placed the folder carefully in front of him. Mom, he began, using the same artificial tone people use with difficult customers, we have been reviewing the estate situation. Estate situation? He spoke about his father's death like a corporate inconvenience. You are financially secure already, Vanessa added smoothly. Nobody is trying to hurt you. I folded my hands together tightly beneath the table. Then why are you here? Daniel slid several papers toward me. This would simplify things for everyone. I looked down at the documents. Property transfer forms. Trust amendments. Legal language shifting authority and future ownership percentages. They wanted me to voluntarily surrender portions of Richard's estate early. My chest felt hollow. It has not even been a week since your father died, I whispered. Daniel exhaled impatiently. This is exactly what I mean. You are emotional instead of practical. Emotional. After burying my husband of 42 years, Vanessa leaned forward with a softer voice clearly practiced in advance. Margaret, maintaining properties like this at your age is stressful. Daniel is only trying to help manage things before they become overwhelming. At your age. I suddenly realized neither of them saw me as a grieving widow anymore. To them I was an obstacle standing between them and financial relief. They had already reduced me to paperwork. I pushed the documents back across the table untouched. I need more time. Daniel's jaw tightened immediately. Time for what? Time to think. Vanessa exchanged a quick glance with him before forcing another smile. Of course, she said sweetly. We just know Richard would have wanted the family taken care of. That sentence almost made me laugh. Because for the first time since Richard's death, I understood something clearly. My husband had already taken care of the family. The problem was that Daniel and Vanessa no longer considered me part of it. The next morning I called Evelyn before I could lose my nerve. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone while waiting for her assistant to transfer the call. Part of me still wanted someone to tell me this was all a misunderstanding. That grief had temporarily twisted Daniel into someone unrecognizable, and eventually my son would come back to himself. But deep down I already knew the truth. Evelyn answered in her calm professional voice, though I could hear exhaustion underneath it. I was probably not the only grieving family member she had dealt with that week. Margaret, she said gently, I was actually planning to call you today. My stomach tightened immediately. Why? There was a brief pause. Because your husband left additional instructions that I believe you need to hear in person. An hour later, I was sitting back inside the same conference room where Daniel humiliated me days earlier. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows overlooking downtown Charleston, illuminating tiny dust particles floating through the air. Everything looked exactly the same, yet I felt completely different walking into that office now. Less confused, less naive. Evelyn closed the door carefully before sitting across from me with a thick file folder in front of her. Richard updated the trust 6 months ago, she explained quietly. He added protective provisions. Protective from what? I asked. Evelyn folded her hands together. From financial coercion. Hearing those words out loud made my chest feel cold. She opened the folder and slid several documents toward me. Your husband became concerned after discovering Daniel had accumulated significant debt. I stared down at pages filled with numbers, account references, and property records I barely understood. How significant? Evelyn hesitated carefully before answering. Over $2 million. I honestly thought I misheard her. $2 million. My voice came out barely above a whisper. How is that even possible? Evelyn explained everything slowly, almost like she was afraid too much information at once might overwhelm me. Failed real estate investments, refinanced business loans, credit card balances, luxury expenses funded by borrowed money. Apparently Daniel and Vanessa had spent years maintaining a lifestyle far beyond what they could actually afford. The vacations, the private school tuition, the country club membership, the designer furniture constantly appearing in their social media photographs. Nearly all of it rested on debt. Richard helped them privately several times, Evelyn continued, but he eventually realized the pattern was not improving. I closed my eyes briefly as memories rushed back all at once. Richard becoming unusually quiet after phone calls with Daniel. Late-night conversations behind closed study doors. The tension I sensed but ignored because I trusted our son. Why did he not tell me? Ask softly. Evelyn gave me a sad look. I think he was trying to protect you from exactly this situation. For several moments neither of us spoke. The air conditioner hummed softly above us while traffic moved outside several floors below. Finally Evelyn pulled out one final document separate from the others. This is the clause Richard added shortly before his death. She placed the paper carefully in front of me. Under no circumstance can trust assets be redistributed, transferred, or accelerated if pressure, intimidation, or emotional manipulation toward you is documented by legal counsel. I read the sentence twice before looking up at her. Meaning what exactly? Meaning if Daniel or Vanessa attempt to force you into surrendering your portion of the estate, Evelyn explained calmly, their access to several major trust distributions can be delayed indefinitely. For the first time since Richard died, I felt something besides grief. Not relief exactly. Something steadier than that. Like my husband was still protecting me somehow even after he was gone. He knew, I whispered. Evelyn nodded slowly. Richard loved your son very much. But near the end, he became concerned that desperation was changing Daniel's judgment. Desperation. That word stayed with me during the drive home. Because desperate people often stop seeing others as human beings. They start seeing opportunities instead. Obstacles. Resources. I understood now why Daniel looked at me with anger instead of sadness during the reading of the will. In his mind, every dollar left to me was a dollar unavailable to solve his problems. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the late afternoon sun had turned the sky pale gold above the oak trees lining our street. I sat in the car for several minutes staring at the house Richard built for us nearly 3 decades earlier. This home held birthday parties, Christmas mornings, college graduation dinners, and countless ordinary evenings filled with laughter that once felt permanent. Now the silence inside it sounded different. Not empty exactly, clearer. Like I was finally seeing my family without the comforting illusions I carried for years. Then my phone buzzed again. A text message from Vanessa. Family dinner Sunday at our house. We should all reset and move forward together. Reading those words sent a chill through me stronger than fear. Because after everything I had learned that morning, I suddenly understood something important. They were not inviting me to dinner to heal the family. They were preparing for another negotiation. Sunday evening arrived hot and heavy with the kind of Carolina humidity that made the air feel thick before a thunderstorm. I sat in my driveway for nearly 5 minutes staring at Daniel's house before finally forcing myself out of the car. The property looked exactly like something from a real estate magazine. Perfect landscaping, white columns, expensive outdoor lighting, everything polished so carefully it almost looked artificial. Richard used to admire this house when Daniel first bought it 5 years earlier. "I hope they can truly afford all this," he said once while we stood in the kitchen during Thanksgiving. At the time I laughed and told him he worried too much. Standing there now, I realized he had probably already known the truth even then. Vanessa opened the front door before I reached it. She wore a soft cream sweater and pearl earrings, dressed deliberately modest for once. The performance began immediately. "Margaret," she said warmly, pulling me into a quick hug that felt rehearsed. "We are so glad you came." Inside, the dining room table was beautifully arranged with candles, wine glasses, and polished silverware. Daniel stood near the kitchen island pouring iced tea into tall glasses like we were simply gathering for a peaceful family dinner, instead of negotiating the ruins of our relationship. "Mom," he said carefully, "thanks for coming." His tone had changed completely from the lawyer's office. Softer, controlled, but something about it felt unnatural, as though he had practiced sounding compassionate in advance. Lily barely glanced up from her phone when I kissed the top of her head. "Hi, Grandma," she mumbled before returning to her screen. We sat down to dinner while Vanessa served baked salmon, roasted asparagus, and garlic mashed potatoes arranged so perfectly they could have belonged in a cooking magazine. For several minutes they avoided discussing anything serious. Vanessa complimented my blouse. Daniel asked whether the air conditioner at my house was still making noise. It was all painfully artificial, like actors trying to perform a version of a happy family nobody believed anymore. Then halfway through dinner, Vanessa finally set down her wine glass and sighed softly. "I think we all got off on the wrong foot the other day." There it was, the conversation they invited me here to have. Daniel rubbed his forehead as though burdened by stress. "Mom, I know I was harsh. Harsh. Not cruel. Not humiliating. Just harsh. Your father's death has been difficult for everyone," he continued, "especially with all the financial uncertainty now." I stayed quiet, letting him talk. That seemed to make him uncomfortable. People often reveal more when silence forces them to fill it. Vanessa leaned forward sympathetically. "We are just trying to think long term," she explained. "Managing multiple properties, investments, taxes. It is a lot for one person." Again with the same argument. My age. My supposed inability to manage my own life. "Your father trusted me with those responsibilities," I replied calmly. Daniel's expression tightened for a split second before smoothing over again. "Nobody is saying you cannot handle things," he said quickly. "But it would make sense to simplify the structure now instead of later." Simplify. Another polished word disguising greed underneath it. I noticed the leather folder sitting on the kitchen counter nearby. The same folder Daniel carried into my house days earlier. They had planned this entire evening from the beginning. Dessert arrived next. Vanessa served homemade cheesecake while speaking in that soft, careful voice people use when they are trying to control a conversation without appearing aggressive. "You know," she said lightly, "Richard always cared deeply about keeping wealth within the family." I almost answered immediately before catching myself, because suddenly I remembered Evelyn's warning about coercion, emotional pressure, manipulation. Richard had anticipated all of this. Every compliment, every guilt trip, every attempt to make me feel selfish for protecting myself. Daniel finally stood and retrieved the folder from the counter. He placed it gently beside my plate. "These are revised documents," he explained. "Nothing extreme. Just adjustments that would help stabilize things for everybody." I looked down but did not open the folder. "What kind of adjustments?" "Transfer authority over the lake property," he said carefully. "Some investment restructuring. Future inheritance clarification." Future inheritance clarification. Such cold business language for taking ownership away from your widowed mother less than 2 weeks after her husband's funeral. I slowly folded my napkin and set it beside my plate. Then I looked directly at my son for the first time all evening. "How bad is it, Daniel?" The question hit him harder than I expected. His face changed instantly. Vanessa answered before he could. I do not think financial details are necessary right now. That told me everything. I pushed the folder gently back across the table untouched. I am not signing anything tonight. Silence fell over the room immediately. Lily glanced up from her phone, sensing tension. Daniel's jaw flexed once. Mom, he said quietly, you are making this harder than it needs to be. I held his gaze steadily. No, I answered softly. I think your father already understood exactly how hard this was going to become. I left Daniel's house that night with a strange calmness settling over me for the first time since Richard died. Not peace exactly. More like clarity. The kind that comes after finally accepting something painful you spent years refusing to see. The drive home was quiet except for the sound of tires rolling across damp pavement after an evening rainstorm. Charleston streets glowed beneath yellow streetlights while expensive waterfront restaurants buzzed with couples drinking wine and laughing behind large glass windows. Life kept moving forward for everyone else while my family slowly came apart behind closed doors. When I reached home, I noticed the porch light had burned out. Richard always replaced those things immediately. Standing there in the darkness fumbling for my keys made the loneliness hit harder than usual. But once I stepped inside, I realized something unexpected. The house no longer felt empty. It felt honest. There were no forced smiles here. No manipulative conversations disguised as concern. Just silence and truth. I slept better that night than I had in weeks. Monday morning began with another call from Evelyn. Margaret, she said carefully. Daniel contacted the office. I leaned against the kitchen counter, gripping my coffee mug tighter. What did he want? He requested an emergency meeting regarding trust distribution timelines. I almost laughed from disbelief. Richard had not even been gone 2 weeks. And I declined without your approval. I thanked her quietly before hanging up, but the conversation confirmed what I already suspected. Daniel was running out of time. Desperate people become impatient when they realize control is slipping away. Around noon, I drove to a small cafe near the marina to meet my longtime friend Patricia. We had known each other since our sons played Little League baseball together almost 30 years earlier. Patricia listened carefully while stirring cream into her coffee, her expression growing darker the more I explained. Margaret, she finally said, I am going to tell you something uncomfortable. At this point, I doubt anything could surprise me. She hesitated briefly. People have been talking about Daniel and Vanessa for months. A cold feeling spread through my chest. Talking about what? Money problems. Lawsuits. Late payments. She lowered her voice slightly. One of my neighbors serves on the board at Daniel's country club. Apparently their membership fees are months behind. I stared at her silently. Patricia looked genuinely sad for me. I did not want to bring gossip into your grief, she continued softly. But I think you deserve to understand how serious this may be. For years I believed Daniel and Vanessa lived comfortably because Richard's company paid him well. I never questioned the expensive renovations, the luxury vacations, or the private schools because parents want to believe their children are thriving. Now every polished image I accepted at face value looked completely different. Their perfect life had been balanced on debt the entire time. After lunch I stopped by the grocery store on the way home. While standing in line at checkout, I noticed 2 women several feet away whispering quietly while glancing in my direction. One of them quickly looked away when our eyes met. Normally I would have ignored something like that, but after the disaster at the lawyer's office, embarrassment clung to me everywhere. I suddenly wondered how many people already knew pieces of our family situation. In southern towns, bad news travels faster than hurricanes. By evening another storm rolled over Charleston, rattling rain against the windows while thunder echoed faintly across the harbor. I sat in Richard's study reviewing the documents Evelyn gave me when my phone buzzed again. This time it was Lily. Grandma, can I come over tomorrow after school? I blinked in surprise. Lily almost never texted me directly. Of course, sweetheart, I replied immediately. Several minutes passed before another message appeared. Do not tell Mom and Dad I texted you. My heart tightened instantly. The next afternoon Lily arrived still wearing her school uniform skirt and carrying an oversized backpack slung over one shoulder. She looked nervous standing in my entryway, twisting the strap of her bag in her hands. Are you hungry? I asked gently. She nodded, so I made grilled cheese sandwiches while she sat quietly at the kitchen island. For several minutes she barely spoke. Then finally, in a small voice, she asked, "Grandma, are Mom and Dad in trouble?" I turned slowly toward her. "Why would you ask that?" Lily stared down at the counter. "Because they fight about money almost every night now." The room suddenly felt very still. "What kind of things do they say?" She swallowed hard. "Dad keeps saying everything will be fixed once the estate clears." Estate. Not Grandpa's memory. Not family healing. Just money. Lily looked up at me then with eyes far older than 13 years should look. "Grandma," she whispered, "Mom said if you do not cooperate we could lose the house." Lily's words stayed with me long after she left that afternoon. If you do not cooperate we could lose the house. Not if Daniel worked harder. Not if Vanessa stopped spending money they did not have. Somehow their survival had become my responsibility. I stood at the kitchen window for nearly an hour after Lily's father picked her up, watching rainwater drip slowly from the oak trees in the backyard, while anger settled quietly inside me for the first time. Not loud anger. Not rage. Something colder. Clearer. Because they had involved their daughter now. They were allowing a 13-year-old child to carry the stress of adult financial disasters, while teaching her that family loyalty meant pressuring her grieving grandmother. Richard would have been heartbroken if he knew that. The next morning Evelyn called again requesting another meeting. "Daniel's attorney contacted our office," she explained carefully. "Attorney?" I repeated. "Why would he need an attorney? They are pushing aggressively for accelerated trust access." I closed my eyes briefly. Every day seemed to reveal another layer of desperation beneath Daniel's polished exterior. "There is something else," Evelyn added. "I believe you should hear this in person." By noon I was back at Harper & Associates sitting across from Evelyn in the same conference room that now felt permanently stained by humiliation and betrayal. She slid several documents toward me with a grave expression. Daniel attempted to use projected inheritance assets as leverage against outstanding debt obligations. I frowned slightly. What does that mean exactly? It means lenders were expecting him to receive substantial access to Richard's estate quickly. My stomach tightened immediately. And now? Evelyn folded her hands together calmly. Now those lenders are becoming nervous. Suddenly everything made sense. The urgency. The pressure. The fake family dinner. Daniel was not simply being greedy anymore. He was cornered. "How bad is it?" I asked quietly. Evelyn hesitated before answering. "Worse than I initially understood." She explained that several business investments connected to Daniel had collapsed over the previous year. Properties lost value. Loans matured. Interest rates climbed. At one point he apparently borrowed against expected future distributions connected to Richard's company holdings. "Your husband discovered this shortly before his final hospitalization," Evelyn said softly. "That is when he amended the trust." I stared down at the polished table, unable to speak for several moments. Richard had spent his final months protecting me while carrying the knowledge that our own son might try to exploit his death financially. The heartbreak of that realization nearly crushed me. "There is one more thing," Evelyn continued carefully. "Because of documented coercive behavior during the initial reading and subsequent interactions, the protective clause is now active." I looked up slowly. Meaning several trust distributions tied to Daniel are automatically suspended pending legal review. The room became completely silent. I almost expected to feel satisfaction hearing those words. Instead I only felt tired. Deeply tired. "Does Daniel know?" I asked. Evelyn nodded once. "He was informed this morning." I exhaled slowly, already imagining his reaction. "Then he is going to blame me." "Margaret," Evelyn said firmly, "this was your husband's decision, not yours." But families rarely care about legal technicalities when money disappears. By the time I returned home, my phone already showed 4 missed calls from Daniel and 2 from Vanessa. I ignored them all. 30 minutes later the doorbell rang. Through the front window I saw Daniel standing on the porch alone. The second I opened the door, I noticed how different he looked. His expensive button-down shirt was wrinkled. Dark circles shadowed beneath his eyes. For the first time in years my son looked genuinely afraid. "Mom," he said quickly, stepping inside before I answered. What did you tell Evelyn? I closed the door quietly behind him. I told her the truth. He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. You had no right to trigger that clause. I stared at him in disbelief. Your father created that clause. Because you manipulated him against us. There it was again. Not grief. Not accountability. Blame. Daniel paced across the living room while rain tapped steadily against the windows outside. Do you understand what happens now? He demanded. Banks are freezing everything. Investors are pulling back. We could lose the house. The same sentence Lily whispered yesterday. I looked at my son standing in the home where he once built blanket forts beside the fireplace and begged Richard to teach him how to ride a bicycle in the driveway. He looked like a stranger now. A frightened, desperate stranger who no longer saw people clearly through the panic of losing money. Finally I spoke softly. Your father spent 40 years building security for this family. Daniel laughed bitterly. And now you are destroying it. I held his gaze steadily for several seconds before answering. No, Daniel. Your father realized long before I did that you were already destroying it yourself. Daniel stood in my living room breathing hard after his accusation, waiting for me to apologize for consequences he created himself. Rain continued tapping softly against the windows while thunder rolled somewhere far over the harbor. For a long moment neither of us spoke. Then finally I walked past him into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water with hands steadier than they had been in weeks. Something inside me had changed. I was no longer reacting emotionally to every manipulation because I finally understood the truth clearly. Daniel did not come here looking for comfort or reconciliation. He came looking for rescue. Mom, he said again, his voice softer now, almost pleading. If the banks call the loans, everything falls apart. I turned slowly toward him. Then you should have thought about that before building a life you could not afford. The words surprised even me. I had spent decades cushioning Daniel from discomfort, defending him, excusing him, fixing things quietly behind the scenes whenever life became difficult. But grief has a strange way of stripping away illusions. I suddenly saw how many times Richard and I protected our son from consequences that might have taught him responsibility years ago. Daniel stared at me like he no longer recognized the woman standing in front of him. So that is it? He asked bitterly. You are just going to watch us lose everything? I set the glass down carefully on the counter. No, Daniel, I answered quietly. You lost perspective long before you risked losing money. He laughed once under his breath, exhausted and angry at the same time. You think this is about greed? I think your father died believing his own son saw him as a bank account. That sentence finally landed. I saw it in Daniel's face immediately. The anger faltered for just a second beneath something else. Shame maybe. Or grief buried too deeply beneath panic to surface properly. But the moment passed quickly. Vanessa was right, he muttered. You never respected our life. I looked at him sadly. Your father and I would have respected any life you honestly built for yourself. What we could not respect was pretending. Daniel left 20 minutes later without another word. He did not hug me goodbye. He did not apologize. The front door closed behind him with a hollow sound that echoed through the house long after his car disappeared down the street. I stood there in silence, realizing something painful but necessary. Sometimes love for your child means refusing to destroy yourself, protecting them from consequences they created. Over the following weeks, everything changed quietly. Daniel's country club membership disappeared first. Then the luxury SUV Vanessa drove was returned to the dealership. A month later, I heard through Patricia that their Charlotte house had quietly been listed for sale. People in town whispered, of course. Southern communities always do. But eventually even gossip loses interest and moves on to fresher scandals. Meanwhile, I began building a different kind of life. One not centered around waiting for my son to call, or worrying whether I had done enough for everyone else. I sold the Charleston house that had become too large and too full of ghosts after Richard's death. The morning I handed over the keys, I stood alone on the empty back porch listening to seagulls drifting over the water while warm October wind moved through the trees. I cried then. Not because I regretted leaving, but because I finally accepted that some chapters of life truly end whether we are ready or not. I bought a small cottage outside Beaufort near the coast where mornings smelled like salt air and jasmine blooming along old fences. The house had a blue front door, a tiny screened porch, and just enough space for one peaceful life. For the first time in years, silence no longer felt lonely. It felt restful. Lily continued visiting me occasionally on weekends. Without Vanessa around, she slowly relaxed into the sweet, thoughtful girl I remembered from years earlier. One afternoon while we baked peach cobbler together, she asked quietly, "Grandma, do you still love Dad?" The question caught me off guard. I thought carefully before answering. "I will always love him," I said softly. "But loving someone does not mean allowing them to hurt you." Lily nodded slowly, like she was storing those words somewhere important for later in life. Daniel called several times over the following months. At first the messages sounded defensive, then angry, eventually just tired. I listened to every voicemail once before deleting them. Not out of cruelty, out of peace, because I finally understood something Richard learned before I did. Family is not measured by who demands the most from you. It is measured by who protects your dignity when you are weakest. And in the end, the greatest inheritance my husband left me was not money, property, or legal protection. It was the painful wisdom to stop confusing sacrifice with love.